Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Heather Stewart. I work as a Biodiversity Officer at Cardinia Shire Council. We'll start with our acknowledgement to the traditional owners. So Cardinia Shire acknowledges that we are on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you everyone for attending our very first Gardens for Wildlife online workshop. Today you'll learn about wildlife gardening basics to start you on your journey. Cardinia Shire has run the Gardens for Wildlife program for about 5 years now. It's a free program where residents are shown how to attract wildlife to their garden and improve the habitat. Due to COVID restrictions, the program has had to move online, and we've used it as an opportunity to try out these workshops to see how they're received. The program is a partnership between Cardinia Shire, land care networks, friends groups, nurseries and local volunteers. If you complete tonight's workshop, you'll be sent a link to register for a free plant voucher valued at $20 for the Cardinia Environment Coalition nursery based at the Deep Creek Reserve. The nursery will be open from the 30th of April this year, so it's a brand new nursery which we're super excited to be opening with the Cardinia Environment Coalition, and the nursery will be the home of the Gardens for Wildlife project, which is wonderful. So the Deep Creek Reserve is Council's environmental site. It has a natural playground, wetlands, cafe, golf club, now an Indigenous plant nursery. So you can have a day out with your friends or family and come and get some plants to start your new garden. I'd like to introduce you to Richard from Sustainable Gardening Australia. He's an expert in Indigenous gardens and how to attract all sorts of different wonderful wildlife to your garden. He'll guide you through tonight's presentation, and I'll also keep an eye on the chats to see if there are any questions. If anyone's got any questions, you can either raise your hand or feel free to pop them up in the little chat bar there, and we'll answer them as soon as we can. We're also recording tonight's session, so if you don't want to be seen or heard, I'm not exactly sure how Zoom works, pop it up in the chat and you can remain relatively anonymous. Thanks so much.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Heather. And I was also just like to recognise I'm in the land of the Wurundjeri people here in Lower Plenty, and also recognise that the Aboriginal culture has a very strong relationships with the earth, with the environment, with all the animals and the plants. And so, you know, learning about biodiversity and what we can do is also showing respect, I suppose, to a lot of the traditional knowledge from the Aboriginal people as well. Thank you for calling me an expert. I like to call myself a generalist. I'm a gardener, basically, and so I like to garden, but I like to also share the things that I learn about as well, which is where I come from, the perspective I come from. So let me share my screen, and we'll start this presentation. So we've got an hour together, and what we're going to be talking about today is a bit of an introduction of how you can start a wildlife garden and some of the basic things and the initial things that you need to start to think about when you're looking at your garden. So before we do start, I've just got a few little housekeeping things here. So your cameras and your microphones have been turned off, so you don't need to worry about being seen or heard tonight. You've got a couple of buttons in front of you. So there is a chat button. So if you have just some general chat or resources that you'd like to share with the group, certainly throwing them in the chat. But if you could actually try and keep your questions to the Q&A side, and then we'll make sure that we can keep those sort of housed in that area. Heather will help keep an eye on that, and we'll ask some questions as we go through as well. So certainly as you got a question in your mind, just think about it and put it down in the Q&A section. As Heather mentioned, there is a recording being made, so that will be available after this, and there will be notes as well along with that. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do right now is just going to quickly put up a little poll so that I can get a little bit of a gauge of who we have here tonight. So there's 3 simple questions. One about, have you heard of SGA before? Number 2 is the sort of garden that how you would describe your garden. And then number 3 is how many people are watching your screen, because sometimes we get more than a couple people online at any one time on one screen. So we'll just let that run for a little bit. We'll gather all of the answers, and then I'll just share that with you. Okay. going well. Just leave it for another 5 seconds or so. We won't leave it for too long because we've got lots of stuff to get through tonight. Okay, and I'll close that off now. And I'll just share the results. So 56% or 55% have heard of you. So there's about just less than half that haven't. So I'll give you a really quick brief intro of SGA in a moment. You can see here the types of gardens that people have. So generally it's that medium to large size garden. But even for the smaller gardens, there's lots of things that you might be able to get out of this presentation tonight. And the majority of you are there your own. There's one couple, so welcome to that couple. So that's excellent. So let me just close that off and let's make a start. So SGA, or Sustainable Gardening Australia. So we're a non-for-profit organisation which is really about trying to help people or to provide resources and education for people to do really good things in their garden that help the natural environment, like helping biodiversity. It's about growing food in your own garden and building community. We have a website there, SGA Online, that you can find lots of information on to help you with your projects, and we're on social media as well. And you can subscribe to our free newsletter called Cuttings. It's a monthly newsletter which comes out with lots of new tips and ideas and articles on sustainable gardening. So you can subscribe to that online. We've also got a Friends of SGA, and this is about us trying to develop a community around us to help support us and a little bit of funding for us to continue the work that we do. And for a $25 annual fee, you get an additional newsletter called Flourish, which comes out quarterly, I think. You get access to some discount seeds and so on. You can see some of our partners over there on the right-hand side. And you also get discounts to our masterclasses and other events that we have occasionally. So you can find out more info on SGA Online for that as well. But what we're here to talk about today is starting a garden. So we're going to really go through some of the fundamental things that you would need to think about when you're starting a garden for wildlife. And a garden for wildlife is really a complete ecosystem in itself. And so here we have this ecosystem pyramid, which shows that we have the soil and then the plants, and then we have different types of animals living in it, the herbivore animals, the carnivores, and then the higher order. And a garden, to be in balance and to be a healthy ecosystem, will have all of these different elements working in it. But what we're going to really focus in on today is the soil and the plants. The later webinars that we're going to do in the coming weeks, we'll start looking at these other parts of this ecosystem. But today it's primarily on the plants and the soils and how we start our gardens. But in doing that, we need to know why we're doing it. And what we're trying to do for the wildlife in providing a habitat garden is to provide food, which is a lot of plant material, nectars and pollens, leaves, but also things like insects and other reptiles might be food for different animals. We're providing water so that these animals have water in our garden. We're providing places for shelter, and we're also providing places and resources for breeding and nesting. And so all of these elements start to build up of what we actually need to do in our garden. Now here is Bill's garden from Frankston, and you can see where he started with a fairly, it was a fairly old block of land or house, and he had this area in the front. And so he's gone through and he started by putting in some tube stocks, and you can see at the front, at the top there, and then that started to evolve and developed as he's mulched it and provided some water and so on. And you can see how that's densely built out now on the right-hand side into this really dense, beautiful, thick habitat, which lots of little birds and all sorts of lizards and stuff would like to live in. And that just shows the progression and how you can start off with a small area and build that up over time to be a beautiful habitat. But where you need to start is to thinking about a bit of a plan. What do I have? What locations do I have in my block of land? Where's my house? Where's my gardens? But also understanding a little bit about where it's really sunny, if there's some wet or very dry spots, where it's really windy, and therefore that will help you understand how you might want to design your garden and the types of plants you might want to plant. Even small gardens really benefit from you sitting down with a bit of paper and putting some ideas down on it and getting it sorted out in your head, including those extra features, the existing features, but those features you might want to build into it. One of the tips I have is think big, but be realistic about what will fit in and start small when you're actually implementing. So you get something happening and then expand out from there. So it's sustainable over time. And really have fun with it. Have fun with this stage about planning and stretching your imagination, getting inspiration from some of the gardens that are around you and seeing what you might be able to do in your own plot. So having a plan and a bit of a drawing is a really great start. But where all of these gardens start is in the soil. So we're going to spend the next little bit just talking about soil. And basically the soil which is the thing that recycles all of the nutrients, all the plants, all the animals, all the manures that basically get recycled through the soil, and they push all of the energy and the nutrients back up the pyramid. When they eventually come back down, they get recycled through the soil again. And it just shows how important the soil is. So what is a good, healthy soil? So a good, healthy soil, they've got this little pie graph on the left. It's half of it's solid, and actually half of it's also a space that's either filled with water and air. So a good soil is going to be about 45% mineral particles, and that's what we often call, I like to call as maybe the dirt. It's just the dirt part, it's the mineral particles. A good soil will also have some organic matter. We're going to talk about organic matter a fair bit through this talk tonight, because it's really important that we're adding it into our soils. But then the other half of a good soil is a space that swings between water and air. And it's really critical that we have this element of water and air in there. And the perfect one is about 25% water and about 25% air. So if we have this really good structure of soil, then our roots of our plants will be able to explore deep, and therefore they'll be able to be very strong and resilient and healthy plants. If we've got this good soil structure, then the water will actually get stored really nicely in that soil. It will move around the soil as it's required, and it will get released into our plants, into the roots as it's needed. That water is also providing a lot of solubility for the nutrients that feed the plants. This good soil with all of these gaps with air also allows for an exchange of gas, because all the life that lives in our soil actually breathes out carbon dioxide, and it needs to exchange back with new oxygen. So all of these gaps in our soils are really important for air exchange. And then we add all that together, and then we have a really beautiful habitat for all of the soil life, the soil food web to live, where it gets food and water and air for it to be able to thrive. And it's that soil food web that we'll learn a little bit about a little bit more later. So we're going to look at soil from three perspectives: from its physical perspective, from its chemical perspective, and its biological perspective. And all of these things work together to create a really healthy and dynamic soil. So from the physical perspective, soil is basically made up of three main elements. So hard elements or solid elements. It's sand, it's silt, and it's clay. And depending on what portions of those three things you have, that will dictate what type of soil you have. So we've got a little pyramid here which just talks about the different types of soil. And you can see we've got sand here on the bottom, we've got clay on the left-hand side and silt on the right-hand side. And we won't go into this into too much detail, but the way you actually use this is you work out how much clay, sand and silt you have, and you can work out what sort of soil you have. You can zero it in. And a really good soil sits in the middle here somewhere, where it's sort of a loamy, has a loam feature to it. If you have a solid clay, it can be very hard to grow things in. If you have pure sand, it's very hard as well, or pure silt. And so often we know what sort of soil we have, and we might think, oh, okay, well, do we need to amend it? Now, before we go on to amending soil types, the first thing I wanted to sort of highlight is that if that is actually what I'd call your indigenous soil or your native soil to your area, and it's not been disturbed with builders' fill or been turned over through building and so on, if that's your indigenous soil, then start thinking about doing less amendment, but by actually using the indigenous plants that live in that beautiful soil that you have. So our indigenous plants have evolved over thousands of years to like the soils that they're in. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the nurseries that are available to you, but you should be able to find some plants that really thrive in that soil. but also with that localized soil food web or soil biota, that life that's living in that soil. So if you choose the right plants to live in, to plant in your habitat garden, you won't necessarily need to do a lot of soil amendment. One thing that you might want to do is loosen it and moisten it. So often those soils can get compacted when there's either been walked on or machinery put on them. And so you need to loosen it up a little bit, not turn it, but just loosen it a bit and let some moisture in it. So you get that voids and that air and water coming back into it. The other thing I'd like to point out with an Indigenous garden, so this is a bit different than with a veggie garden, but with an Indigenous or a wildlife garden, the best place to put your organic matter, and we'll talk about organic matter soon, is at the top. In the veggie garden, you're more likely to dig it in, but I would suggest, an Indigenous garden, it's your mulches and putting your organic matter at the top and letting that work its own way through, so not disturbing the soil. So the sorts of organic matters that are really good for an Indigenous garden are your bark and wood chip mulches, the natural leaf litter or bush litter, bush mulch that might be falling off your trees, any leaf molds that you might have. So all of those things are really good sources of organic matter for an Indigenous or wildlife garden. Now, if you are starting afresh, a garden bed, you might decide that, okay, I still want to do a bit of a soil amendment. So my approach is start on the minimal before you get to doing maximum or larger types of amendment. If you were to, I often get asked the question, should I use compost? Now, I wouldn't be using a homemade veggie compost, so from your veggie scraps and so on. That's very rich in vegetable-based nutrients. It's very rich in bacterias, and often it's got lots of seeds, like from tomatoes and pumpkins and all those sort of things. So for my veggie garden, I'd use that, but for my wildlife or Indigenous garden, if I was going to use some compost, I wouldn't use that. I'd try and get a commercial one, which has gone through a hop composting system, so all the seeds have been killed off, and it isn't as rich as a home compost. So if you were looking for compost, I'd do that. But a lot of soils, as I said, if you've got your Indigenous plants, they shouldn't need to have that addition anyway. But one thing you can think about adding is some seaweed solution. So that's a great tonic. It's got very little in nutrients. It's got some minerals and some rooting hormones in it. But it's a really good tonic for plants. And so it's something, especially if you've got waterlogged soils or very dry soils, having a bit of seaweed solution every now and again can help. But if you did have some sandy soils, what you can look at doing, or one of the problems with sandy soils is that the nutrients and the water don't get retained. They get drained and washed away. So it's a very hard soil to grow things in. And the soil struggles to hold structure because there's lots of sand in there. So what you can do to try and improve your sandy soils is adding organic matter. And you're going to hear this add organic matter through a lot of this talk tonight. And that could be, for example, some of that commercial compost. You might want to look at doing a little bit of biochar. So soak that in some existing wet soil. So get a slurry and put some biochar in it to get some of those microbes into it. And that is really good for water retention and for a home for microbes. Sandy soils can also lack a lot of minerals, so you might want to sprinkle some rock dust in it. And over in WA, where they have very sandy soils, they do add some additional clay elements like bentonite and kaolinite. Now, I personally haven't had experience with that, but there are some websites over based in the West where they do talk about that if you needed to do a little research. Sandy soils can get a bit hydrophobic, which means that the water doesn't sink in. So maybe using a humus-based wetting agent might be good, but just be careful with the wetting agents because they have surfactants in it, which if that moves through into our water system, into our drains and creeks, can impact the wildlife. So we need to be very careful with that. Mulching on top is very important as well. And if that you're talking about your veggie gardens, then you might like to also look at a green manure crop. Now, on the other extreme, we have clay soils. And so many of us, I live in a clay-ish area, and I've got some clay areas in my garden, not all of them are. But clay soils can also be very hard to work with. And how much amendment that you want to do really depends on a couple of things. your desire or your need to change your soil structure. So if you want to grow plants that don't like heavy clay soils, then you might need to do it. But you might be able to grow some indigenous plants without having to change it too much. If the soil has been very greatly disturbed in the past through building or being that subsoil being brought up, and therefore the topsoil is no longer there, then you might need to do some amendments. So it depends on the level of clay. And as I said, it depends on what you want to plant as well and the amount of time. It's a slow process and it takes a lot of effort and potentially some money as well, depending on what you want to do. Now, down the bottom of this slide, and this will be on your handouts as well, I've got sort of a continuum of changes that you can do. So on the minimum level, I would, if you just want to do a little bit, maybe placing some of that good organic matter on the top of the soil, some of that compost maybe, and then putting some mulch on top of it. So that's the minimum. If you wanted to do a little bit more, I wouldn't turn the soil over, but I'd be looking at aerating it with a fork and then maybe adding some gypsum and watering that through. And the gypsum will help to break apart some of those clay particles. The next step, if you want to do a little bit more than just turning it with a fork or opening it with a fork, is that you can get a machine in to rip it up a little, which really puts a blade through the soil and starts to create much bigger voids. The next step up, you might want to actually mix through that soil, not just on the top, but through that soil, adding some of that compost as an example. And then the next level up is you might need to add some drainage, some aggie pipes, or you might need to build your soil up with some raised garden beds or something like that, some raising of the area so you have more topsoil. And so you can see that depending on what you want to achieve and how much you need to or want to do, there are different steps that you can do. And over time, it's a very slow process, but over time, hopefully you'd be able to improve it. But again, thinking about those plants that actually might like that soil is a really a good place to start. So I might just see, Heather, if there's any questions on that so far before we get into pH.
We had one question, which was about is seaweed fertilizer different to a seaweed solution? So I was
So you can get so Seasoil actually makes a combination. So Seasoil will make a feed that actually has the seaweed solution in it, and I don't know if it's like a carp or a fish emulsion or something, which has got a lot of nitrogen and other things in it. But you can just get a seaweed solution as well, which is just pure a brew made from seaweed, basically. And so it has basically no nitrogen, no potassium, and no phosphorus in it at all. So it has none of the macronutrients which are considered to be fertilizers, but it does have some minerals and some good tonics for plants. So it's a very good thing to add at that level.
So just to clarify, you want the one that's pure seaweed or the one that's seaweed plus fertilizer? Which one would you be opting for?
I'd be in my veggie garden. I'd be doing the one with the nutrients. Mm-hmm. In my wildlife garden, I'd just be going for the straight seaweed solution.
Okay, so we've got a few more questions now. We've started on our topic of soils, which is pretty exciting. The first one is, I've got a clay layer due to our new build, very common in our local area.
Yep.
Then we've put 20 centimetres topsoil on it. What is an ideal depth of topsoil?
Look, 20 centimetres is pretty good actually, because over time I'd still recommend that you'll be putting in organic matter on top, and so that will, like the mulches and so on, and over time that will actually start to build up even more topsoil. So a 20 centimetre is a really good starting point. If it's still like clay underneath, I'd still every now and again be throwing a bit of gypsum down, because that will wash down into the soil and into the clay area. It will break up some of them, release some of those clay connections of the clay particle and loosen it up, so the roots will even be able to get down into there. So I'd still be looking at a bit of gypsum every now and again.
Next question, also on the clay soils, is how do I know how much intervention to do to my clay soil? Do I start small?
I would start small, but it also depends on if you're starting afresh and you're not quite sure. Yeah, start small. But if you've been trying for many years and you know you've got a big problem, then you might want to start a little bit bigger. It depends on your level of perseverance and experience, I suppose, with that particular soil. I'd also look at digging down and having a look at it. If it is really just that real yellow, heavy clay, then you potentially are going to need to do something a little bit more dramatic than if it's a little bit more looser and has a bit more other particles in there. So one way you can tell whether you need to do a lot of work, and I do mention this later on when planting, is if you dig a hole about 30 centimetres deep and you fill it with water, and if it takes longer than 4 hours to drain, then you know that you're going to have a bit of a problem with, the amount of water in the soil. If it drains in less than 4 hours, then you shouldn't need to do too much because the water is escaping, and therefore the roots will still be able to get lots of oxygen. So that void will get replaced. The water void will get replaced with the air void. If it's longer than 4 hours, then you might need to start looking at some of these larger sort of interventions.
That's a wonderful tip. And the questioner has said, yes, it's heavy yellow clay. So we know we've got that in the local area. And the last question we've got is a concern about the seaweed solution. And is it local seaweed from Victoria? And what ability does the product have to be used so extensively without causing issues with seaweed? I think they're saying, how's it harvested ethically?
Yeah, it depends on where. There's a couple of different companies that make it. So Seasol is one, and you'd have to have a look at their particular. Some of them are very sustainable in how they're quite regulated on how they can actually take seaweed. So you'd actually really have to look at the suppliers' websites to get an idea of, and maybe even shoot them an email to get an idea of. Are they harvesting it in a sustainable way? Because you don't want to be actually having big impacts on the environment by using it from that perspective. Seasol, from my understanding, I spoke to them maybe last year, and they were saying that they've improved a lot. They're really quite strict now with their sustainability ethics, I suppose, on how they're actually harvesting that particular material. So, but certainly have a look on the websites of the particular companies to see what you can find out.
And another question's come in, which is, how often should we be putting on a new layer of mulch? That's a really good one, isn't it?
That's a really good one. And when we get into the next part of the soil, or soon, which is the life in the soil, they're basically consuming the mulch over time. And so I would say that, every 18 months or so, you're probably going to look at topping it up. It's really when it gets to be less than about 5 centimetres thick that, we say between 2.5 and 7.5 centimetres is a good thickness of mulch. And so as that starts decreasing, it will depend upon how active your soil is and the creatures in your soil, and then you'll start to need to top it up. But probably every 18 months to 2 years, I suspect.
Perfect. That answers the question. So if we go on,
Beautiful.
Should we go on to the next one?
We'll go on to pH, and I was only going to spend a little bit of time on pH. So pH is a bigger issue in a veggie garden. So pH is the level of acidity or alkalinity in the soil, and you can buy a little test kit from your garden centre, and there's instructions in there how you can test the pH of your soil. And a lot of our plants like this 6 to 7.5, which is around this neutral area. But sometimes our soils are more acidic or they're more alkaline. Now, again, getting back to using Indigenous plants, the Indigenous plants of your area should be adapted to the acidity of your levels of your soil. So rather than having to adapt your soils, you adapt your plants that you're using to work well with that soil. And we're talking to your Indigenous nurseries, the people there, they'd be able to help you a lot with that. But if you did need to either reduce the acidity, which is bring it from a low number to a high number, or decrease your alkalinity from a high number back into this middle numbers, there's a couple things you can do. The first thing, adding organic matter over time is a really good thing to do to amend and neutralise pH. But if you have a very low number, which means it's acidic, and you wanted to bring it back up again, Garden lime or dolomite lime. So you'd sprinkle a handful of that over a square metre and water that in, and over time that will increase the pH. And on the other side, if you're trying to decrease your pH, take it from a high number to a low number, from an alkaline to a neutral, then you can get sulfur powder, and you do that during the warmer months because it's actually the bacteria that are doing that conversion, and they're more active in the warmer months. So that's the other option. But again, using your indigenous plants that like that particular soil type is the easier solution as well. And for native plants, again, it varies, but the Western Australian natives, they actually prefer a more of an alkaline soil. So if you're trying to grow things like kangaroo paws and those more exotic natives here in Victoria, you may have to look at doing some soil amendment because they like the more alkaline soil. Whereas the clay belt and the Melbourne plants, not all of them, not all areas, but as a general rule, the clay belts is more of an acidic loving plants. So they'll be the ones that will potentially be native to your areas. So we'll have a quick look at biology. So biology is actually the living part of the soil. So the physical side that we talked about is the structural side of soil, but biology is where the life comes into it. And this little picture here is just an artistic representation of the life that's below the soil. So we've got all this beautiful kingdom of life above the soil with our plants and animals, but underneath it is a beautiful habitat full of life as well. And the more activity and life there is in this below soil habitat, the more productive our garden's going to be. So this life is it's feeding on the carbon. So the carbon, which is like the mulches and all of the foods that we put on top, eventually end up into the soil, and that feeds this soil food web. But also the plants, so plants photosynthesize to get their energy or convert their energy into the sun's energy into sugar or glucose, and they use that to grow. So that's their food. But they also, through their roots, they push a good amount of that sugar into the soil to feed all of this. Now, what happens is it recycles all this carbon and all this, it accesses lots of nutrients in the soils, and then it becomes available back up to the plants. And so having a really good active food soil web means that our gardens will be much more active. And there are so many different animals that are living in this. And there's different ones that there's some bacteria that have symbiotic relationships with the roots of the plants, and they actually form little nodules and they fix bacteria. There's fungi that drill into the roots and they become extensions of the root system, and they extend out and they feed lots of nutrients back into the roots. And as a result, in return, they get sugar from the plant. So they're working together. There's lots of shredders and transporters that break up all of the carbon matter into small amounts and pull it back down into the soil, and they're things like the millipedes and earthworms and ants. There's lots of free-ranging bacteria and fungi in our soils that decompose all of these things and make them available back into the plants. And then it's not just all beer and skittles. There's lots of predators in there as well. So there's lots of creatures that predate on all of these other things and on each other. And by predating on them, when they use up they kill something, they use the nutrients they need, and that's when they're releasing all the rest of the nutrients back up into the plants. So it's a very dynamic set of life that's down there, and they're basically awesome gardeners. And that's what we need to try and to stimulate in our gardens, whether it be a veggie garden or a wildlife or habitat garden or an exotic garden. And the simple things that we can do to make that happen, the first one is adding organic matter. So that is what we've talked about, the mulch and the leaf litter and all that sort of stuff. It feeds the soil food web. It actually improves soil structure over time. And it also improves water holding and nutrient holding in our soil. So it's got lots of really good benefits. Let's try and avoid garden chemicals, so the heavy fertilizers and insecticides, because those things can really disrupt all of that life underneath the soil as well. We need to try and keep our soil moist, not just for the plants, but also for the soil food web, because all of these little creatures need water to survive. They need to hydrate. So they need that water as well. So keeping our soil moist, and that's where the mulch comes in as well, because that's a great retention strategy for moisture. We try and minimise our digging because, again, by exposing our soil to the ultraviolet light and destroying all these made cavities that have been made by worms and other animals, we're disrupting that soil food web. So sometimes we might need to dig, but let's try and minimise it where we can. We need to try and avoid compaction, which is where we put heavy things on our soil and it removes those voids where all of that air and water go down. And so we need to try and stop compaction where we can, and also prevent erosion, because our soils are very thin here in Australia, and so we need to keep them. So it's either your mulch again, or having lots of plant cover so that there's really no plants actually, soil actually exposed. Now, I do have a little clip here I'm just going to show and talk through. I did some weeding in my front garden. This was last year, and this was in one of my little indige beds, and I just noted all of this life that was going on. So I'm just going to talk you through. You can see all these slaters, and which are great at breaking up organic material into smaller parts. And I turn this bit of bark over, and you can see all the filaments of the fungi that's breaking down the carbon as well. You can see the little toadstools here, little brown mushrooms, which are the fruiting element of all of these fungi. So a Indigenous garden or is really dominated by fungi. So if you've got lots of fungi in your garden, that's a great example of a good soil food web. And these are the earthworms I found. So they're not the little ones that you might find in your compost, but they're very large and very slow moving earthworms. And so that, again, is another really good indicator of a good healthy soil. And you can see the size of it there. It's quite large. That's just showing it there. So the mulch, I've talked about mulch. It's got so many benefits for our garden. So it keeps the soil moist because it reduces the amount of evaporation. It is an amazing habitat for insects and lizards. So it's a really important habitat element as well. It provides shelter, it provides food for insects, and also then lizards come along and live in there and feed off the insects, and the birds feed off the insects and so on. If you choose the right mulches, it can help suppress weeds. It's adding nutrients as it breaks down. It reduces that runoff and erosion. It keeps the soil friable and reduces compacting. It even regulates soil temperature. So there are so many benefits from actually having mulch in our pathways, but also on our particular garden beds as well. So which mulch? Really good question. For our Indigenous or our exotic gardens, our perennial gardens with trees and shrubs and all that sort of stuff, you'd go for a tree mulch, or a bark, or a chip mulch. With your veggie gardens, you'd go more for a straw mulch, so I won't cover that one today. But then I've broken it into two types. I've called them ground cover mulch and soil conditioner mulch. And it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Now, a ground cover mulch is really chunky, big chunky bits with minimal fine particles in it. And it could be one of these landscape or native mulches as well. It breaks down quite slowly and it releases nutrients slowly. But because it's all big and chunky, it gives good water penetration. So when it rains, the water gets through and the air gets through. So you get this air exchange. Keeping the water moist, it can suppress weeds really well because there's no place for the weeds to get roots sort of holding onto. And there's all of these other benefits as well. Now, so that's good for those reasons. If you want to do something that's more about conditioning your soil, get something that's finer. So a finer mulch is better has a lot more finer particles. It will break down quicker. So with a fine mulch, about 70% of it would disappear in the first 12 months. And then another 50% and then another 30%. So it gets consumed a lot quicker and it's adding a lot more nutrients into the soil. The offset to that is that weeds can grow in it quicker. And it can get a little bit more compacted, so not as much moisture and air can get through at times because it's a lot more finer particles. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve, which one you might choose. Now, we might just see if there's any questions, but this is another garden that was in the Frankston area. So it was just another beautiful example of, and I forgot to put the name on it. That's very bad of me. Another example of, oh no, there it is. It's up the top, Miranda's garden, of just the sorts of things that you can do in your backyard or front yard. I'll just see if there's some more questions there.
Oh, there's some brilliant questions streaming in, Richard. So the first one we've got, are deciduous leaves suitable as mulch/organic matter for Indigenous plants?
Deciduous, yeah. So I let my leaves just fall and where they are, and they just basically become part of, if it's the eucalypts and stuff, they're a little bit harder and tougher, and so they will take longer to break down. I still have them in my garden. Sometimes if you want to speed that up a bit, you can run over your lawnmower over them and break them up a little bit. But if it's more of an oak and all of those sort of things, they make really good leaf molds over time. So they break down and they become really fine, good leaf molds. Again, it's broken down through bacterias rather than they're broken down more by fungi, less so by bacteria. So they're a very good supplement or conditioner for these types of soils.
So any tips on the kind of mulch to use in an Indigenous garden? Is gum tree mulch okay?
Yep. Because if you think about what's happening in nature, before we were here, and with our gardens, and it's the gum trees and the she oaks and all of those sort of things that would be naturally dropping their leaves, and so that's a beautiful. I call it a bush mulch basically, and it's a beautiful mulch to have.
Okay, the next one is: does ground cover mulch eventually become soil conditioning mulch?
Yes, it does. It does. It's just slower. It's bigger chunks, so there's less surface area to it. It's a bit like a compost, to be honest. If you put half an apple in, it'll take quite a long time to break down because there's not much surface area. But if you chop that apple up into lots of small parts and put it in your compost, it'll break down really quickly. And it's the same with mulch. The bigger it is, the slower it is, but it will still break down and become soil conditioner.
So the next one, I'm actually not familiar with this term, but they've said, what's your opinion on flung dung? I'm going to assume that's animal droppings.
I think flung dung is a natural soil. It's either a conditioner or fertilizer. I can't remember. So I'd be using it. I think it's more bacterial based. And so I think it would be a very good additive into your veggie gardens and maybe for any annual flowers. So if you've got lots of annual flowers that you might be planting, then it would be good for that. Less so, I suspect, for a fungus dominated soil, which is more our Indigenous gardens.
Okay, and what's an example of a soil conditioning mulch? So maybe some examples.
A soil conditioning mulch, well, you just have to look at the fine particles. I think a yuki mulch is often quite fine. It's really just it's just something that's really quite finely shredded and doesn't have, and often you might even that soft fall mulch they use underneath playgrounds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It would break down very quickly because it's just very finely mulched as opposed to a big chunky one.
And so we've got a good one, which is the mulch from arborists okay to use once season? So that bush mulch that we often get offered for free from arborists, is that?
Yep. I do use that. It's good to if you can get a good relationship with an arborist or a tree lopper. I only get it when it's from native plants and that they're from healthy trees. So I don't want to bring any fungal issues in or other plant diseases in. I know that it's native. So even if there are some seeds in there, it'll be native seeds as opposed to pitostrum seeds or other exotic type plants that I might bring in. Definitely let it mature. But again, having a good relationship with an arborist where you can say, I've got some really good mix of, red gum and yellow box or something or other. Are you interested? Then I definitely, and it's local, it's cheaper, it's recycling. And it's a good option, and it's really a good mixture of, because as opposed to a bark mulch, it's a good mixture of chips and fine and large particles. So the bark will be in there, the leaves will be in there, so it's a real good mixture of all sorts of things.
So we've got a bit of a follow-up. So who flung dung is biologically activated nutrient-rich, weed-free absorbent super mulch. It does sound a bit more like a veggie patch type mulch.
Could be, yeah. I want to look it into a little bit more, but it certainly sounds it might be good. But they might also recommend, I don't know how it's made and stuff, so they might recommend it for others as well. So maybe a little bit more research.
And the next question we've got is, what is a natural way of getting rid of or reducing broadleaf weeds? Pulling out is very difficult for me.
Okay.
So a lot of people don't want to sit there hand pulling, which
okay. Well,
we can all understand.
I'm going to do a little section soon on preparing, and I'll actually cover off on that.
Okay.
So we'll cover off on that one
Let
then.
me have a look. Oh, one more. We've moved into a house with red mulch that doesn't seem to break down. Would it be better to get rid of it altogether and replace, or persist and wait it out?
Was it red mulch, was it? So it's been coloured,
Yeah,
has
you know
it?
that colourful one that landscapers give you?
I don't like that personally. Look, it shouldn't have any issues. It might need to be a little bit more moist, maybe. It should break down. I can't imagine that the dyes that they put in there would actually stop the decomposition process. If they are, then I'd be concerned. I think you could probably be okay to maybe top it up with some other mulch, and then it will actually get a little bit more moisture in it because it would be not quite the top surface of the mulch. And once it gets the moisture in it, that's when the fungi and the bacteria will get in there and start to break it down a little bit quicker, maybe.
Would you top it up maybe with one of your finer mulches that would have decomposed a bit more quickly, or what type of mulch?
Potentially, yeah, you could potentially do that, yeah, for a bit of soil conditioning mulch.
That appears to be all the questions that we've got for now.
Beautiful.
We'll keep going.
Okay, so garden structure. So when you're starting afresh, or you're looking at your existing garden, when you're looking at a habitat garden, you need to think in 3 dimensions, because an open garden with lots of lawn provides very little in the way of food and shelter for animals. And so you have to start thinking about vertical elements in your garden, the vertical element. And the real tip is, the more layers you can put in, the more complexity and the more diversity of plants that you put in, the more wildlife you will attract. So you might be lucky enough to have a garden big enough to put a canopy tree in, or a couple, or you might already have some, and that's awesome. Not everybody has a garden that's big enough to do that. So they would then start looking at the mid-story. So if you've got canopy trees, then start looking at your mid-story as well, which are these smaller trees, larger shrubs. Then you look at your understory. So you need lots of small shrubs underneath that as well. And then you'd start looking at your ground covers and grasses and all those things that will cover up the soil as well, and putting your mulch on top of that. You might need to have your water element, but also rocks and logs and those sort of things are important habitat elements. And then you're also looking after your soil underneath. So you've got to look at soil in all these different layers, and your garden in all these different layers, and think about what your garden is now and what layers are missing. So that will help you identify some of the things you might need to start thinking about adding in, some more ground covers or some more shrubs, or even some more mid-story or taller canopy trees. Indigenous plants, we've talked about those a little bit. They are really, really suited to your local climate and soil. They thrive on the rainfall they get. It helps preserve that local plant ecology, which is really important, because a lot of all our wildlife is evolved with these plants as their food sources and shelters and so on. And so continuing on that consistency of plants is really important for the wildlife as well. One of the, I noticed the Cardinia has the Indigenous Plant Guide, which was built up with Casey by the looks of it. So there's a great resource there that you can do a little bit of research on that. And there's also lots of Indigenous nurseries that you can actually potentially tap into, including the one that Heather mentioned at the beginning of the session, the Cardinia Environmental Coalition Nursery, which is opening up in April. So there's lots of different Indigenous nurseries. Don't just think of them as a place to get plants. Think of them as a place to get advice on the gardens, on your soil, what you can plant, what will attract what sort of different animals and all that sort of stuff as well. So use them as a really good resource for your garden planning. Avoid environmental weeds. There's lots of invasive plants. They've got superpowers, these plants, because they can spread very easily through seeds or fragments of plant and so on. So there's a great website called weeds.org.au where you can go on and you can check out what are weeds, what ones are weeds in your area, I think, as well. So it can be some of the exotics, but even some of the natives. So they might be native or indigenous to another state of Australia, but in our state they might actually become environmental weeds because they outgrow some of our indigenous plants. So be careful about the environmental weeds. Which gets us into where that last question was, which is around preparation. So there's a couple of ways that you can do preparation. You can just do mulch over and go straight that way. What I did, this is my garden, this is what I did this year, and we did sheet mulching, where we did a couple of layers of cardboard, which really smothers a lot of the weeds and stops the seeds from growing while the cardboard's still there. And then I put that good layer of, and this is an arborist mulch on top, so you can see that structure of that arborist mulch there. And I've only had about in the last 9 months, of only a couple of handfuls of weeds have come up in that area. The cardboard will break down and will eventually become, because it's carbon, and it will just become part of the soil. But that's a great way of kicking started. If you've got the really invasive cooch and kikuyu and those sort of weeds, this is good for the summer weed, the winter weeds, those sort of annual weeds that come along. The other option is to do some solarization. So this is where you put down for a period of time some black plastic, weigh it down. Best doing this through summer when it gets really hot, and it cooks the plants. Unfortunately, it's not great for the soil food web as well, but then you're going to build it up over time. So after a couple of months of that being down, especially with the sun on it, this was actually done on there was the kikuyu lawns and so on, grasses were through this area, those running grasses. And then they've done the mulching. You could even do sheet mulching if you wanted to, and then put the mulch down. So that's a great way of doing a large area or a lawned area or an area that has some particular strong weed issues to deal with. So you do have to put up with it for a little bit while it's black plastic's down, and you need to make sure it's weighed down so that it doesn't blow around. So once you've done that, you might want to actually start thinking about your plants. So I was just going to go through some of the steps to actually starting afresh with some plants. First of all, choose the good ones. It's about choosing your plants. And spring and autumn are the best time to be planting these. Okay, and spring and autumn means they get chance to actually get established before the summer comes along. Now, believe it or not, tube stock, which are these little forestry tubes, are the quickest to grow. So if you're after a quick garden, don't go for the big plants, go for these little tube stocks, but choose ones that are very healthy and not root bound. So you can see this picture on the right where it's all root bound, that one will struggle. Whereas this one here on the left, got lots of space, lots of air and water and lots of areas for the roots to grow, that one will grow very quickly. Okay. One way of seeing without taking the plant out, if you squeeze the pot and it's quite resistant to your squeezing, you can imagine squeezing this, then it's probably got quite a lot of roots in there. If it's quite loose and gives, that probably means that it's probably pretty good. And that means you don't have to take all the plants out to actually see them to know. Also, you can see down the bottom here, if you lift underneath in a root-bound pot, you might see lots of little fibrous roots down the bottom, whereas this one you might not see any, or maybe just a couple of little white roots poking out. Now, before you plant, make sure that it's nice and moist, and maybe even soak it in a bit of this seaweed solution because it's a good tonic and helps with transplant shock. Digging your hole. So dig a hole that's a couple of times bigger, wider than your pot. So a good hole is needed because that's where all the roots are going to start to move out into. So 2 to 3 times wider. Keep the soil on the top there. Break up any large clumps that you can. And even if you need to, if you can't get rid of all the large clumps, maybe put a bit of, you can use a bit of potting mix as a bit of a backfill as well. Check the drainage though of that area. So this is where I mentioned that you can dig a hole, put some water in it. If it takes longer than 4 hours to drain, then it might not be the best hole for you. If it's less than that, then that should be pretty good. So remove carefully the plant from the pot, and you can tap it to try and, rather than just pulling it out and not damage it, so tap it on the ground or on something, just try and loosen it up a little bit. And if there are still a few roots in there, you might want to tickle them a little bit just to loosen them up. But the more aggressive you get with your tickling and root disturbance, then the more recovery that the plant has to make before it can actually start to grow nice and healthy. You'll then put the pot plant in. As I said before, if it's an Indigenous soil, an Indigenous plant, you really shouldn't need to put a lot of nutrients in with it or soil conditioner. So I just put the natural soil back in, gently push it down, but don't step on it and push it all down. That's really compacting it. So just make sure it's nicely firm in. Backfill it and water it, maybe make a little channel, a little moat around it so it can hold the water, and give it a good soaking. Then for the first little period, you might need to install, if you've got lots of wildlife around already, you might need to install some plant guards to help protect it. I'd be looking at you putting your mulches down, not right up to the trunk of the plant, but just sort of around it where the roots are eventually going to grow. And then for the first 6 months or 12 months, I'd be keeping a real good eye on it. Probably need to do some watering until it's really well established through the first summer maybe. Keeping on top of the weeds. Pruning after they're flowered helps encourage more growth and more dense growth, and just refreshing your mulch as you require. Is there any more questions there? I'm just checking the time. We're getting close to our time. Just see if there's any more questions there before we go on.
We do have some more questions. Richard, I'll just grab those up. So the first one is, I've noticed you've mulched your paths. Would you recommend this over crushed rock?
Yes, I would. So crushed rock has, for me anyway, crushed rock doesn't add anything to the soil. So even though it's your path, you'll have lots of roots under there, so they'll actually still be looking for nutrients. So crushed rock has no nutrient value. The crushed rock can also get quite hot, especially it's in full sun, and so that will potentially not be great for the soil underneath when it gets really hot. So the wood mulches and the bark mulches are much more, for me anyway, a much more preferable pathway. It does mean that you have to replace it or top it up. Also with crushed rock, it's harder to get rid of if you want to change it over.
And the next question we've got is, how damaging is using weed killer like Roundup in the preparation of wildlife garden?
SGA and myself personally don't recommend it because of the impact that it can potentially have in the longer run. Sometimes it may be necessary for some really hard things like blackberries, which are notoriously hard to get rid of, so very woody, hard weeds. But then I'd be looking at using it very conservatively making sure that there's no spray drift and it's not impacting anything else around. But from SGA's perspective, we recommend trying not to use those really harsh glyphosate-based herbicides. So, yep.
We've also got, I'm thinking we still do at the reception at council, the weed dabber bottles. So you can put your herbicide or whatever type of chemical you're intending to use in that dabber bottle, and that way you don't have chemicals drifting off into the air, and you can target those to the weeds, and that's sometimes quite effective.
Yep, no, that's good. So just on that, maybe I'll just keep going. So we do try and reduce the amount of chemicals we're using. Many of our native birds and animals and all sorts of things are natural predators of pests, and that's actually part of their food supply, their food chain. So to the extent that we're starting to kill pests or bugs, insects, with insecticides, we're either going to remove their food layer so they won't be there, or if they eat them, they'll potentially get sick. Also, residuals can end up in the soil and damage the soil food web as well. So we prefer to do low impact solutions, and there's a whole set of webinars we can do on that. But it's about, before you get to low impact chemicals, you look at how you can do physical things like barriers and traps and so on. Then you look at the cultural things, which are the things that we do in the garden, changing our own behaviours so that we reduce pests like snail hotels, like upside, pots and wood piles where snails live. So if we clean those up, we'll have less snails. And then we look at the biological, which is attracting all the beneficial insects. This is about, and animals, this is about building out that ecosystem so that predators can then attack the pests and start to try and get on top of it. And then if those things don't work, then we may look at a lower impact chemical solution. So SGA is launching soon, hopefully, a garden's product guide on our website, which will give you a lot more information about garden chemicals and their impacts on different parts of the environment, and also give you some different ideas about different ways of using lower impact solutions. So keep an eye on our website for that. Rainwater, really good if you could install a tank. If you are, the best way to water is not a broadcast system like this, because this sort of system waters shallow and quite broad across the soil. And so it encourages shallow root systems. Whereas a drip system, which doesn't look from the surface to be as efficient or effective, it creates a lot stronger root systems because the roots go down looking for where the water is. And it's a lot more efficient with water. So you waste a lot less water. It's much more efficient. And so there's a lot of different type drip systems you can get. You can make your own, but the ones through putting all bits and bobs together, I use this one in the brown tube, which has inbuilt drippers every 30 centimetres, I think it is. With a drip system, it's good to have a pressure valve if you've got high pressure, an inline filter, especially if you're using tank water, just to get any little particles out of it, and a flush valve just in case you need to flush it out. So they're just a couple of tips there. So really that's the end. Just to summarise, create that vision of your garden, dream big, but start small and build it out. Try and minimise the amount of amendments to your soil where possible, especially if you're using Indigenous plants in your Indigenous soils. You shouldn't need a lot of amendment. If you're going to add organic matter, add it at the top with mulches, and that will improve the soil over time. It'll get brought down into the soil. Plant Indigenous plants as they love your soil, and they'll grow really well in your climate. Try and avoid those weedy and invasive ones. If you need to do some drastic preparation, either sheet mulching or solarization is a great way to start. Dig a hole 2 to 3 times bigger than your pot. Make sure it's got good drainage. And plant healthy tube stock will grow really quick. So even this garden we're looking here in the background was mainly tube stock, and it grows really well. Plant guards if you need them, if you've got lots of wildlife and rabbits and so on around. Try and avoid the harsh chemicals if you can. Use drip irrigation, and if you're designing a new garden bed, think about it at that stage. And finally, make sure you add a place for yourself to sit and enjoy your garden as it thrives, but also as wildlife comes to visit you. So there you go, that's it. So we'll see if there's any more questions.
I'm not seeing any more questions, Richard. We'll give people a couple of minutes just in case anyone... Yeah. Oh, Amy's got her hand up. I think that's how this works.
Yeah, well, I haven't actually used the hand up that much.
No, I actually...
I think it's best to maybe just to put your question in the Q&A. I think that's the best way to...
So we've got someone that says, wow, you are amazing, thank you. So not so much a question, but a good compliment.
I can take all of those.
When people were thinking of whether they had any more questions, you will get an email with a link to a $20 free plant voucher for the new Cardinia Environment Coalition nursery at Deep Creek. So the nursery will be opening in the end of April, start of May. So that's actually the perfect time to plant, which will be brilliant. Really good. So people can come in when it's autumn, when the weather starts to cool down and your plants are ready to be planted, and kickstart their garden, which is exciting. Oh, well, it looks like we've got a few questions. Amazing, fantastic. Thank you, thank you. Deep planting natives. I'm not sure if that's a question. Deep planting natives. Are they saying maybe we need to plant natives deeper?
Deeper. There is. I have heard a theory that that's a good thing, but I've also heard some people I do respect who I think it's been promoted a little bit on ABC Gardening Australia, but there is one person I do respect that did doubt it a little bit and had some issues with maybe some of the long-term issues around the trunk area and how that potentially could get impacted over time because it's not naturally where the soil would have been up to. So it's really from that perspective, it was about making sure you get a good hole, invest in time and money in getting a good hole with some good loose soil around it and let the roots do that nice deep growing anyway.
So Dean has answered back and has said it's trees such as eucalyptus. Angus Stewart suggested it, and he's tried some red gums this summer. So maybe Dean could let us know in a year's time if it's worked.
Yep, that would be good. I haven't done it myself. I certainly do it with my tomatoes. I plant them deep because they can actually give off more roots at that structure, at that particular zone that's now under the soil. But I haven't tried it with natives.
Cool. I'm not seeing any other questions springing to mind. Thank you, everyone, for participating in our very first webinar. We have 5 others in the series, so beautiful birds, lovely lizards, butterflies and bees. We've got one about fairy animals, and we've got one on frogs, which seems to be quite popular too. So feel free to register for any of the other sessions and learn about the other different elements to a habitat garden. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Richard, for presenting. I learned a lot during this session too.
Beautiful, and thank you for all those awesome questions. It was excellent. So I'll over the next couple of days, I'll get the recording link and the notes to Heather, and then she can distribute those out for you to either look back on, and there'll be lots of notes there as well for you to use. So thank you very much, everybody,
Thanks,
and
everyone,
have a good night.
Good night. Okay, see ya.
Okay, bye-bye.